The late afternoon sun bled gold across the vast Colorado plains, casting long shadows from the weathered barns and sturdy fences of Stone's Throw Ranch, Jedediah. Jed Stone stood on his wraparound porch, the worn timber creaking familiarly under his boots as he drew in a deep breath of air thick with the scent of hay, livestock, and dry earth. This land wasn't just property, it was history, breathed into the soil by 3 generations of Stones who had carved a life from the rugged landscape long before the asphalt ribbons of progress had reached this far. The silence here was profound, broken only by the low nicker of a horse in the corral or the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. But the silence wasn't as complete as it once was. Beyond the southern fence line where Jed's ancestral acres met the new reality lay Golden Meadow Estates. It rose like a meticulously planned mirage, rows of gleaming houses, each variation adhering to a strict palette, lawns clipped with unnatural precision, sidewalks swept clean. There was an imposed order there that felt alien compared to the organic sprawl of the working ranch. It represented a different world, one pushing ever closer, threatening to hem in the open spaces Jed cherished. This unfolding local story was one of transition, and Jed felt like a relic caught in its tide. That's when he saw her, a solitary figure walking purposefully up the dusty track leading to his house. Even from a distance, she radiated an air of crisp formality that clashed with the rustic setting. As she drew nearer, Jed noted the severe cut of her pantsuit, the tightly coiled bun that allowed no stray hairs, and the formidable clipboard clutched under her arm like a shield or a scepter. She moved with a brisk efficiency that suggested she wasn't here for a neighborly chat. She stopped at the bottom step, her gaze sweeping critically over the sturdy, if slightly battered barn, the stacked round bales near the fence, the corral where 2 geldings swished their tails lazily. Her nose seemed to wrinkle slightly, as if processing unfamiliar and perhaps unpleasant sensory input. "Mr. Stone." Her voice was clear and carried a businesslike edge. Her eyes flicking down to the clipboard, as if confirming his identity against a list, Jed gave a slow, deliberate nod, touching the brim of his worn Stetson. "Ma'am, I am Eleanor Vance," she announced, extending no hand, offering no smile. Chairperson of the Golden Meadow Homeowners Association, Jed waited, his expression calm but watchful. He had a feeling he knew where this neighbor dispute was headed. "Mr. Stone," she continued, her tone sharpening slightly, "the HOA has received formal complaints regarding certain aspects of your property visible from Golden Meadow, specifically concerning aesthetic standards. The visual blight presented by some of your outbuildings and equipment, and frankly, the unpleasant odors associated with your livestock." Jed felt a familiar stir of weary defensiveness, the same feeling his father had described when the first surveyors for the development appeared years ago. He kept his voice even. "Mrs. Vance, this ranch Stone's Throw has been here long before. Golden Meadow was even a blueprint. My grandfather built that barn with his own hands. Ranching involves livestock and equipment, works the land. That's the nature of it." He gestured broadly, encompassing the working reality around them. Eleanor's lips thinned. "Be that as it may, the HOA's purview extends to the entire perimeter bordering Golden Meadow Estates. Our covenant's conditions and restrictions are quite clear on maintaining certain community standards to protect property values and resident quality of life. We expect cooperation in addressing these issues." Her gaze was unwavering, leaving no doubt about her determination. This wasn't just a complaint. It felt like the opening salvo in a larger HOA conflict. Jed stood his ground, the old wood solid beneath him. "This land has its own standards, Mrs. Vance. Older ones. It operates under agricultural zoning that predates your association by decades." He held her gaze, letting the statement hang in the air. A flicker of annoyance crossed Eleanor's face, quickly masked by practiced neutrality. She gave a curt nod. "We will be in touch regarding specific violations and required remedies." Without another word, she turned stiffly and marched back down the track. Her posture rigid, the clipboard held firm. Jed watched her go. The golden peace of the evening shattered. The air suddenly felt heavier, charged with unspoken conflict. He could sense this was only the beginning, the first line drawn in the dust between his heritage and the encroaching demands of Golden Meadow. A storm was brewing, not in the sky, but right here on the edge of the plains. The official-looking envelopes started arriving like clockwork, delivered by a mail carrier who now offered Jed a look, mixing pity and curiosity. At first, Jed tossed them onto the kitchen table with a sigh, figuring it was just Eleanor Vance blowing off steam. But the notices kept coming, each one meticulously typed on crisp Golden Meadow Estates letterhead, each citing a different, increasingly specific infraction against the voluminous CC&Rs Jed had never agreed to. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, a relentless campaign waged through bureaucratic ink 1 week. It was the color of the main barn. Apparently the traditional weathered wren was deemed inconsistent with the approved neutral palette of the estates. The next, a demand arrived concerning the type of wire fencing along the southern edge. It wasn't the aesthetically pleasing split rail or wrought iron stipulated for perimeter views. Then came the notices about the manure pile near the stables, a necessary byproduct of ranch life, cited for unpleasant odors and visual nuisance. Each letter felt like a deliberate jab, a calculated attempt to dismantle his way of life. Piece by bureaucratic piece, Jed tried reasoning. He called the phone number listed for the HOA office only to navigate an automated menu that led nowhere, ending in a full voicemail box. He sent a polite but firm email detailing the ranch's grandfathered status and the agricultural nature of his operations. The reply, when it finally came days later, was a generic message stating that all properties bordering the estates were subject to review and compliance was mandatory. He even drove over to the small, pristine office building near the Golden Meadow entrance during posted hours, only to find the door locked, the windows dark. It felt like wrestling with a phantom, a system designed for frustration. The whole ordeal began to feel less like a simple neighbor dispute and more like a targeted harassment campaign. Despite the mounting frustration, Jed channeled his energy methodically. His father had always said, when dealing with paper pushers, keep your own paper straight. He started a thick file carefully logging each notice, dating his attempted replies, and printing copies of the vague email exchanges. If Eleanor Vance wanted a paper war, he'd be ready. Then came the night that shifted the conflict from annoying paperwork to something more invasive. It was well past midnight. The ranch settled into a deep, quiet darkness. Under a sliver of moon, Jed was drifting off to sleep when a flicker of light against his bedroom window startled him awake. He slipped out of bed and peered through the curtains. Down by the fence line bordering Golden Meadow, 2 powerful flashlight beams were cutting through the night, sweeping slowly across his barn, his equipment shed even lingering on the house itself. A cold knot of anger tightened in Jed's stomach. This wasn't an inspection. This felt like trespassing, like being watched sized up in the dark. He pulled on his boots and a jacket, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight of his own, and strode out into the cool night air. As he approached the fence, the beam snapped towards him, momentarily blinding him. He shielded his eyes, his own light cutting through the glare to illuminate 2 figures standing just on the public road. Shoulder Eleanor Vance ramrod, straight even in the darkness, and beside her, a nervous-looking man Jed recognized vaguely as Arthur Pendleton, the HOA treasurer. Pendleton shifted uncomfortably, aiming his flashlight downwards. "Can I help you folks?" Jed's voice was low and steady, but held an edge that cut through the night. Eleanor didn't flinch. Conducting a compliance check, Mr. Stone, documenting ongoing violations. Her tone was clipped, authoritative. At 1 a.m, Jed kept his flashlight beam steady on them. "From the road, looks more like snooping to me." Pendleton cleared his throat. "Eleanor, perhaps this isn't the best. We are well within our rights to observe from a public thoroughfare." "Mr. Stone," Eleanor snapped, cutting Pendleton off. Her flashlight beam swept defiantly back towards his barn. "Maybe so," Jed replied, stepping closer to the fence line, his shadow looming large. "But let me be clear. You set 1 foot on my property without permission, day or night, and that is trespassing. I suggest you conduct your checks during daylight hours if you must conduct them at all." And he paused, letting the silence stretch. "And keep better track of your paperwork." "Arthur, I'm keeping copies of everything." Pendleton visibly winced. Eleanor merely glared, her face tight with controlled fury. After a tense moment, she gave a curt nod to Pendleton, and the 2 figures retreated back towards the manicured streets of Golden Meadow, their flashlight beams shrinking into the distance. Jed stood there for a long moment, the silence returning, but now it felt charged, violated. He turned back towards the house, the file on his kitchen table suddenly feeling much heavier. The prying eyes were gone for now, but he knew this siege was far from over. The letters from the Golden Meadow. HOA hadn't stopped, but a new type of official correspondence began appearing in Jed's mailbox, this time bearing the seals of various Park County departments. Eleanor Vance, it seemed, had decided the HOA's own channels weren't yielding results fast enough and had escalated her campaign, weaponizing the broader bureaucracy against him. Jed felt a grim tightening in his chest. This was moving beyond a simple homeowner dispute into something more insidious. The first official visit came from the County Building Safety Department. A polite but thorough inspector named Henderson arrived, clipboard in hand, citing an anonymous complaint regarding the structural integrity of Jed's main barn, the very barn his grandfather had raised decades ago. Jed, masking his irritation, led Henderson through the massive structure. He pointed out the thick hand-hewn timbers, the reinforced joints his father had added after a particularly harsh winter years, back the solid foundation that had weathered countless Colorado storms. Henderson tapped beams, checked supports, consulted his notes, and after nearly an hour gave a slow nod. "She's old, Mr. Stone, but she's solid as a rock," he declared, making notes on his form. "No safety violations here. Whoever filed the complaint was mistaken." Jed merely nodded, watching Henderson drive away. It was a small victory, but the inspection had cost him half a morning's work and left a sour taste in his mouth. Anonymous complaint. My foot, he thought. He knew exactly who was behind it. A week later, another official vehicle crunched up the gravel drive. This time, it was from zoning enforcement, following up on a query about non-conforming land use adjacent to a residential zone. Jed patiently produced the decades-old county records clearly designating Stone's Throw Ranch as agricultural land, grandfathered in long before Golden Meadow Estates was ever conceived. The zoning officer reviewed the documents, made copies, and left with an apology for the inconvenience. "Looks like everything's in order here," she said with a hint of weariness, as if this wasn't the first unfounded zoning complaint she'd investigated recently. The most frustrating incident involved local law enforcement. Jed was working late one evening, mending a section of fence along the southern pasture under the bright glare of his truck's headlights. The familiar sound of calving season meant checking on his herd frequently, day or night. Suddenly, flashing blue and red lights pulsed in the darkness, and a Park County Sheriff's cruiser pulled up beside his truck. A deputy stepped out, flashlight beam cutting through the night. Jed recognized him vaguely from town. Deputy Ray Miller. "Evening, Mr. Stone," Miller said, his voice calm but watchful. "Everything all right out here?" "Just mending fence, deputy," Jed replied, switching off his power drill. "Got a nervous first-time mama cow due any day." "We received a call," Miller continued, his gaze sweeping the area. "Report of suspicious noises possibly related to animal distress near the residential line." Jed sighed inwardly. "Eleanor again." "That'd be my generator and maybe some unhappy hammering deputy. Ranch work doesn't always keep 9 to 5 hours, especially this time of year. The herd's fine." Miller shone his light briefly towards the quiet cattle farther out in the pasture, then back at Jed's setup. He seemed to take in the scene. The toolbox, the fencing supplies, Jed's work-stained clothes. There was nothing remotely suspicious or distressing. "Right," Miller said, a subtle note of understanding creeping into his professional tone. He'd likely dealt with boundary disputes and exaggerated calls before. "Just had to check it out. Sorry to bother you." "Appreciate you doing your job." "Deputy," Jed said, trying to keep the weariness out of his voice. As Miller drove away, Jed leaned against the fence post, the silence feeling heavy again. The inspections had cleared him, validating his rights on paper, but the pattern was undeniable. Eleanor Vance wasn't just annoying. She was becoming actively malicious, using official channels and wasting taxpayer resources in her relentless attempt to bend him to her will. He was resilient. His roots ran deep in this land, but the constant pressure, the feeling of being under siege by bureaucracy, was beginning to take its toll. He could only hope that officials like Henderson and Deputy Miller were starting to see the pattern too. The Colorado sun beat down with midday intensity, reflecting off the surface of the large metal water trough near the southern fence line. Jed Stone was checking the float valve, ensuring his small herd of Angus cattle had fresh water during the heat spell. It was routine work, the kind of quiet maintenance that defined ranch life. He heard the crunch of tires on the gravel track behind him, but didn't immediately turn, assuming it might be his feed supplier. Instead, the clipped, commanding voice of Eleanor Vance cut through the air. "Mr. Stone, that trough is a flagrant violation." Jed straightened up, slowly turning to face her. She wasn't alone this time. Arthur Pendleton, the nervous treasurer, stood slightly behind her, along with another woman Jed didn't recognize, but who carried the same air of stiff disapproval. Likely another HOA board member, Eleanor held her clipboard like a weapon pointing accusingly at the trough. "Ma'am," Jed asked, keeping his voice level, despite the predictable intrusion. "This standing water," Eleanor declared, her voice ringing with self-importance, "is a breeding ground for mosquitoes. It constitutes a health hazard under County Ordinance Section 7 subsection B, not to mention being aesthetically non-compliant with Golden Meadow visual standards." She rattled off the citation as if she'd memorized it specifically for this encounter. Jed looked from her indignant face to the trough, where several cows were currently drinking peacefully. "Mrs. Vance, this is a stock tank. It's essential for my cattle, especially in this heat. I keep it clean, and the water circulates. It's not some neglected pond." He gestured towards the animals. "Are you suggesting my cows go thirsty because you don't like the look of their water source?" "There are alternatives," the unfamiliar board member sniffed, looking down her nose at the trough. "The regulations are clear," Eleanor insisted, her eyes narrowing. "This constitutes a nuisance. We demand you drain it immediately and remove it from view, or face escalating daily fines from the HOA. Jed felt a familiar wave of frustration wash over him, but he held it in check. Arguing logic with Eleanor felt like trying to herd tumbleweeds in a windstorm. "This trough isn't going anywhere, Mrs. Vance. It's necessary for my livestock on my property, which I'll remind you again is zoned for agriculture." He stood his ground, arms crossed loosely over his chest. Eleanor's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. Her tightly controlled composure seemed to crack, revealing a simmering fury beneath. Jed saw her jaw tighten, her knuckles white where she gripped the clipboard. This defiance, this calm refusal to bend to her will, clearly infuriated her. For a moment, she seemed speechless, vibrating with indignation. Then her eyes took on a hard, calculating glint. She abruptly turned slightly away, pulling her smartphone from her pocket with sharp, jerky movements. Her back shielded the screen somewhat, but Jed could hear her voice low and urgent as she spoke into the phone. He caught fragments. "Aggressive homeowner refusing to cooperate. Large man acting erratically, potentially armed. Yes, farm tools nearby." He waved a shovel earlier. "We feel threatened, can't leave." Jed stared bewildered, waved a shovel. He hadn't touched a shovel all morning. Threatened. He hadn't raised his voice or made a single aggressive move. A cold dread different for simple frustration began to creep up his spine. What was she doing? Before he could fully process the absurdity and danger of her words, the distant wail of sirens sliced through the afternoon quiet. One siren, then another, growing rapidly louder, converging on his location. Jed looked down the dusty track in disbelief as first one, then a second, then a third. Park County Sheriff's cruiser roared into view, lights flashing violently, kicking up plumes of dust. They screeched to a halt near the fence line, doors flying open. Deputies spilled out their movements, tense professional hands hovering near their sidearms. Their eyes scanned the scene, focusing instantly on Jed, the large man reported as potentially armed and threatening. For a terrifying moment, Jed felt the weight of their suspicion. The inherent danger of a situation spun wildly out of control by Eleanor's desperate fabrication. He instinctively took a small step back from the trough, slowly raising his hands, halfway, palms out to show he held no weapon, posed no threat, his heart hammered against his ribs. Beside him, Arthur Pendleton looked pale and terrified, clearly shocked by the extreme police response Eleanor had summoned. Even the other board members seemed taken aback by the sudden swarm of uniformed officers. Eleanor, however, stood tall, a mask of feigned fear etched onto her features as she pointed a trembling finger towards Jed. The code-red deception was complete. The officers began to approach cautiously, Deputy Ray Miller among them, his face grim as he processed the high-stakes scene unfolding before him. The air crackled with tension, thick and heavy under the Colorado sun. Jed Stone kept his hands raised, slightly, palms open, his posture deliberately non-threatening despite the adrenaline surging through him. 6. Deputies formed a cautious semicircle, their training evident in their wary stances, their eyes fixed on him. Eleanor Vance stood slightly apart, maintaining her pose of a victim under siege, though a faint triumphant gleam flickered in her eyes as she watched the official response she had orchestrated. Arthur Pendleton looked like he might be physically ill, his face pale and beaded with sweat, avoiding everyone's gaze. Deputy Ray Miller stepped forward, his expression unreadable but professional. He recognized Jed instantly, the memory of the late-night fence-mending call and other minor, likely Eleanor-instigated complaints fresh in his mind. "Mr. Stone, Miller began, his voice calm but carrying authority. "We received a 911 report alleging threats and possibly an armed individual at this location. Can you tell me what's happening here?" "Deputy," Jed replied, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. "Mrs. Vance and her associates here were demanding I drain my stock tank." He gestured towards the trough, where the cows had now backed away nervously. "They claim it's an HOA violation," I explained. "It's necessary for my livestock. That's the extent of it. There were no threats made, no weapons involved." He slowly lowered his hands. "You can see for yourself." Miller's gaze swept the area. The peaceful cattle, the mundane water trough, Jed standing calmly beside it, empty-handed. He then turned his attention to Eleanor Vance. "Ma'am," he said, his tone shifting subtly, becoming more questioning. "The report mentioned you felt threatened that Mr. Stone was possibly armed, waved a farm tool. A shovel was mentioned." "Yes, absolutely," Eleanor affirmed quickly, perhaps too quickly. "He became very agitated when we addressed the violation. He waved, well, there are shovels around." She gestured vaguely towards a distant tool shed. "He was menacing. We felt we couldn't safely leave." Miller held her gaze. "Ma'am, did you see Mr. Stone holding a shovel or any other tool in a threatening manner during this specific interaction?" He waited, his silence demanding a direct answer. Eleanor faltered for a split second. He has them readily available. His demeanor was threatening." "Did he verbally threaten you or your companions?" Miller pressed, his voice remaining level but firm. His tone, his refusal to comply. It implied a threat. Eleanor insisted, clutching her clipboard tighter. Miller exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance with another senior deputy. He'd seen this before. Disputes escalated, facts embellished in the heat of the moment, or worse, deliberately fabricated. He looked back at Arthur Pendleton. "Mr. Pendleton, did you witness Mr. Stone make any direct threats or brandish any tools?" Pendleton swallowed hard, avoiding Eleanor's sharp glare. He shifted his weight, looking down at his shoes. "Well, he was firm," Pendleton mumbled, his voice barely audible. "He didn't. I didn't see a shovel in his hand. No, he just said the trough wasn't going anywhere." The other board member remained silent, her face tight with discomfort, the discrepancy between Eleanor's frantic 911 call and the reality of the scene. A calm rancher, nervous HOA members, and no visible weapon or evidence of immediate threat was becoming starkly apparent. From the edge of the Golden Meadow property line, perhaps drawn by the commotion, Jed saw Maria Flores watching the scene unfold from her meticulously kept yard. Her expression was one of deep concern. Her gaze shifting between the deputies, Eleanor and Jed Miller took a deep breath, his professional demeanor solidifying into one of stern authority, directed squarely at Eleanor. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice dropping slightly, taking on a hard edge. "Making a false or exaggerated 911 report is a serious offense. It triggers a significant emergency response, diverts resources from genuine crises, and puts everyone involved, including officers and the subjects of the call, at unnecessary risk." Eleanor's face turned from flushed red to chalky white. The triumphant gleam in her eyes vanished, replaced by shock and dawning horror. "Based on our assessment here, the immediate situation does not align with the high-priority, potentially dangerous scenario reported." Miller continued coolly, "We find no evidence of an immediate threat or weapon brandishing. This appears to be a civil dispute regarding HOA regulations." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Consider this an official warning. Any further misuse of the 911 system for matters that are not genuine immediate emergencies could result in formal charges being filed against you for false reporting." The humiliation washed over Eleanor in visible waves. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled. She opened her mouth, then closed it, seemingly unable to form a response. Arthur Pendleton looked utterly mortified, edging further away from her. The other board members stared fixedly at the ground. Across the way, Maria Flores slowly shook her head, a look of profound disapproval settling on her face. The reckoning bell had tolled. Eleanor Vance's desperate gamble had backfired spectacularly, stripping away her credibility in front of law enforcement and her own board members. "We'll be documenting this incident thoroughly," Miller stated curtly. He nodded to Jed. "Mr. Stone, looks like you can get back to your work." With that, he signaled to his deputies. The tension began to dissipate as the officers returned to their vehicles. The flashing lights were extinguished, and the cruisers began to pull away, leaving behind a thick cloud of dust. and an even thicker silence, Jed stood alone by the water trough, taking a slow, deep breath. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lost his temper. He had simply stood his ground, and in doing so, he had watched Eleanor Vance inadvertently detonate her own authority. The power dynamic hanging precariously for weeks had just irrevocably shifted. In the days following the dramatic 911 standoff, an uneasy quiet settled over the boundary between Stone's Throw Ranch and Golden Meadow Estates. The usual barrage of HOA violation notices ceased abruptly, as if Eleanor Vance and her remaining board members were holding their breath, perhaps contemplating the severity of Deputy Miller's warning about the false police report, consequences. But the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken reverberations. News, especially news, involving flashing lights and multiple sheriff's deputies traveled fast through the carefully manicured streets of Golden Meadow. Jed sensed the shift, subtly at first. A nod from a man walking his dog along the perimeter road, where previously there had only been averted gazes. A brief sympathetic comment from the cashier at the feed store about HOA troubles. It seemed the story of the overzealous chairperson calling the cops on the quiet rancher next door had struck a chord. This wasn't just Jed's problem anymore. It had become a focal point for simmering discontent within the community, a potent example of HOA conflict reaching a boiling point. Then came a more direct gesture. One late afternoon, as Jed was unsaddling his horse after checking fence lines, Maria Flores approached his gate carrying a covered casserole dish. Her expression was kind, tinged with concern. "Mr. Stone, Jed," she called out hesitantly. Jed walked over, surprised. "Maria, everything all right?" "Everything's fine," she said, offering a small smile as she passed the warm dish over the fence. I made too much pozole. Thought you might like some." Her eyes met his, conveying an understanding that went beyond neighborly politeness. "I saw what happened the other day," she added quietly, "with Mrs. Vance and the deputies. It wasn't right." Jed accepted the dish, the warmth seeping through the towel. "Appreciate that, Maria. Thank you. We've all had our run-ins, you know," Maria continued, her voice low. "Little things, mostly, the wrong shade of trim paint, a garden gnome deemed unapproved, ridiculous fines for garbage cans left out an hour too long. Eleanor runs things with an iron fist. Most folks are too intimidated or too busy to fight back. But what she did to you, calling 911 like that crossed a line? A dangerous line?" She shook her head. "Anyway, enjoy the po-sol." Maria's visit seemed to open a floodgate, albeit a quiet one. Over the next week, 2 other Golden Meadow residents found reasons to stop by Jed's fence line. One older gentleman ostensibly asking for directions Jed knew he didn't need, confided about the constant harassment he faced over his prize-winning rose bushes, allegedly violating landscape uniformity rules. A young mother walking with her toddler paused to share her frustration over threats of fines because her child's brightly colored playset wasn't a natural earth tone. Each story painted a picture of petty tyranny of residents feeling harassed and unheard. They saw Jed's stand, not just as his own fight, but as resistance on behalf of everyone weary of Eleanor's reign. This growing community support felt like a lifeline. Hearing these stories, coupled with the blatant malice of the false 911 call, solidified Jed's resolve. This wasn't just about protecting his ranch anymore. It was about standing up to bullying and the abuse of power. He contacted Ben Carter, an old friend of his father's and a respected lawyer in the county seat, known for his expertise in property rights and land disputes. Sitting in Ben's book-lined office, Jed laid out the entire saga, the initial confrontation, the relentless notices, the late-night surveillance, the county complaints, and finally, the fabricated 911 call, meticulously supported by his file of documented evidence. Ben listened patiently occasionally, asking sharp, clarifying questions. When Jed finished, Ben leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Jed," he said, his voice serious, "based on what you've told me and the documentation you've kept, you have more than just a solid defense here. You have grounds for significant legal action." He explained the strength of the ranch's grandfathered agricultural status, rendering most of the HOA's aesthetic complaints legally baseless regarding Jed's core operations. More importantly, he highlighted Eleanor's pattern of escalating behavior. The constant stream of unfounded complaints, the attempts to use county agencies against you, the intimidation tactics like the late-night visit and culminating in that false 911 report. that paints a clear picture of targeted harassment, Ben stated. We can file suit seeking damages and, crucially, a permanent injunction preventing the HOA specifically misses. Vance from interfering with your property rights or contacting you directly outside of official legitimate channels, if any ever arise. Leaving Ben Carter's office, Jed felt a weight lift replaced by a sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. He had the law, documented truth, and surprisingly, the burgeoning support of wary neighbors on his side. The path ahead might still be rocky, requiring careful HOA dispute resolution, but for the first time it felt clear. Eleanor Vance had pushed too hard, rung the bell too loud, and now the consequences were beginning to gather. The change came swiftly, violently. What began as a darkening sky, bruised purple on the horizon, erupted into a full-blown Colorado tempest by late evening. Wind howled across the plains, rattling the windows of Jed Stone's sturdy ranch house and tearing leaves from the cottonwoods along the creek bed. Rain lashed down, not in drops but in solid sheets, turning the dusty ground into slick mud. Almost instantly, thunder cracked overhead, sharp and close, followed by blinding flashes of lightning that illuminated the drenched landscape. In stark momentary detail, Jed watched from his living room window, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. This wasn't just a summer shower. This was a deluge, the kind that could swell creeks and overwhelm drainage systems in minutes. His unease proved prophetic. Around midnight, his phone rang, startling him out of a light doze. It wasn't Ben Carter or Maria Flores. The caller ID showed the Park County Sheriff's Office dispatch. He answered quickly. "Jed, it's Ray Miller, Deputy." Miller's voice was tight, strained over the roar of the storm, audible even through the phone. "We've got a bad situation developing down here at Golden Meadow." "Flooding?" Jed asked, already moving towards his boots. "Flash flooding," Miller confirmed grimly. "South end, right where your property meets theirs. The main drainage culvert under Meadowlark Lane is completely blocked. Debris may be a washout upstream. Water's backing up fast, Jed. It's already creeping into yards, heading straight for half a dozen houses. Fire department's trying to get pumps going, but the blockage is massive. We need heavy equipment to pull it clear now." Jed didn't need to ask the next question. He knew the county's own heavy equipment was stationed miles away, and getting it mobilized through this storm would take precious time they didn't have. "I saw your tractor when I was out for that other call." Miller said, the unspoken reference to Eleanor's 911 fiasco hanging in the air. "Is it operational? Can you help us? We need that debris cleared before those homes are inundated." There was no hesitation in Jed's response. This wasn't about HOA disputes or past grievances. Homes were threatened. People were potentially in danger. "I'm on my way, Ray," Jed said simply. "Give me 10 minutes to get the tractor fired up and get down there." He hung up and moved with purpose. Pulling on heavy-duty rain gear over his clothes, he grabbed his most powerful flashlight and headed out into the teeth of the storm. The wind nearly tore the back door from his hand. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead instantly. Reaching the equipment shed, he climbed onto the seat of his large, reliable John Deere tractor, the very machine implicitly criticized in HOA notices as unsightly. It roared to life on the second try, its powerful engine a comforting sound against the chaos of the storm. He maneuvered the heavy machine out of the shed, its headlights cutting through the driving rain. The ground was already saturated mud, sucking at the large tires. Driving carefully but quickly, he navigated the familiar track towards the southern edge of his property, aiming for the access point near Meadowlark Lane, where Miller had likely encountered the blockage. Lightning flashed again briefly, illuminating the scene ahead as he neared the estate's boundary. He could see flashing emergency lights reflecting off rising water. Figures in rain slickers, deputies, firefighters, maybe a few desperate homeowners, moved frantically near the inundated culvert. The water was higher than he'd expected, swirling ominously close to the foundations of the nearest houses. Deputy Miller, recognizing the tractor's headlights, waved him forward urgently. Nature itself was putting the community to the test, and in this critical moment, bureaucracy and aesthetic complaints were irrelevant. All that mattered was the capability of the man and his machine against the raw power of the flood. Jed guided the big John Deere tractor carefully through the churning, debris-filled water towards the blocked culvert, its powerful headlights slicing through the storm's fury. The scene was chaotic. Water swirled knee-high around the frantic figures, working near the blockage, their flashlights dancing nervously. The roar of the wind and rain almost drowned out their shouted instructions. Jed could see the water lapping perilously close to the front steps of several expensive Golden Meadow homes, their perfect lawns submerged under muddy floodwater. The destructive potential was terrifyingly real. Deputy Miller slogged through the water to meet him, shouting over the din. "It's a mess. Jed, looks like a couple of small trees, trash construction debris washed down, jammed tight against the grate." Jed nodded grimly, assessing the situation. He expertly maneuvered the tractor into position, the heavy machine groaning slightly as its tires fought for purchase on the saturated ground. Working methodically despite the driving rain and flashing lightning, he lowered the tractor's front loader, using its edge to probe the blockage, trying to find purchase on the tangled mass. It took several attempts, the loader slipping off the slick submerged debris. Homeowners huddled under porch overhangs or watched anxiously from upper windows, their faces pale with fear. Among them, standing rigidly near the edge of the floodwaters, was Eleanor Vance. Her usual immaculate appearance was gone. Her hair was plastered to her head. Her pantsuit soaked her face, a mask of shock and disbelief, as she watched the rancher she'd relentlessly harassed now battling the flood to save her community, perhaps even her own home. Beside her, Arthur Pendleton nervously wrung his hands, his eyes wide with alarm. Finally, Jed managed to hook the edge of the loader under a large section of the debris, what looked like tangled branches interwoven with construction refuse. Engaging the hydraulics, he pulled back slowly, the tractor's engine straining against the immense weight and the force of the backed-up water. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing moved. Then, with a great sucking sound and a groan of tortured metal from the culvert grate, the main part of the blockage began to shift. He pulled it further clear, then used the loader to nudge and push the remaining smaller pieces away from the culvert opening. Almost immediately, the effect was visible. The vortex of water pouring into the culvert intensified, and the flood level on Meadowlark Lane began slowly but perceptibly to drop. A collective sigh of relief seemed to rise from the onlookers, audible even over the storm. Firefighters quickly moved in to clear the remaining smaller debris by hand, ensuring the flow remained unimpeded. As the immediate crisis subsided, several homeowners sloshed through the receding water towards Jed, their faces etched with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Stone," one man called out, shaking Jed's outstretched, rain-slicked hand vigorously. "You saved us. We thought our house was gone." "Incredible work," added a woman, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "That machine. Thank God you were here." Jed simply nodded, accepting their thanks with quiet dignity. "Glad I could help," he said, his voice rough from the strain. He glanced towards where Eleanor Vance had been standing. She was still there, but she hadn't moved closer. She stared at Jed at the tractor, the very symbol of the rural blight she despised, and her expression was unreadable, a complex mix of shock, perhaps resentment, but notably absent of any warmth or gratitude. She met Jed's gaze for a fleeting second, then turned abruptly and walked away, disappearing into the rain-swept darkness towards her own home, leaving Arthur Pendleton standing awkwardly alone. Maria Flores, who had been helping direct flashlight beams, caught Jed's eye and offered him a warm, appreciative smile that spoke volumes. Deputy Miller approached, clapping Jed firmly on the shoulder. "Couldn't have done it without you, Jed. You made the difference tonight." Jed nodded back at Miller, a silent understanding passing between them. He had done what needed to be done, not for praise, but because it was the right thing. Yet Eleanor's pointed refusal even to acknowledge his effort hung in the air. The stark contrast was undeniable. The practical, capable rancher and his unsightly equipment had just saved the pristine, rule-obsessed community from disaster, while its own leader couldn't even muster a simple thank you. In that moment, Eleanor Vance hadn't just avoided expressing gratitude. She had further cemented her isolation, revealing a profound flaw in her character that wouldn't go unnoticed by her weary neighbors. The debt incurred that night was clear, but some debts, it seemed, were destined to remain unpaid. The aftermath of the flood wasn't just receding water, it was a receding tide of support for Eleanor Vance. Her stark failure to acknowledge Jed's crucial help during the crisis, juxtaposed against her prior harassment and the dangerous 911 call, became the final straw for many Golden Meadow residents. The whispers that had started after the police standoff now grew into open conversation, fueled by shared frustration and a newfound sense of solidarity. The dam of intimidation had broken. Within days, a petition began circulating quietly, at first then with growing confidence. Initiated by Maria Flores and a few other fed-up homeowners, it called for an emergency HOA meeting, and demanded Eleanor Vance's immediate resignation from the board, citing mismanagement, abuse of authority, and actions detrimental to the community's safety and reputation. Signatures accumulated rapidly as residents, weary of the petty tyranny and emboldened by recent events, eagerly added their names. Just as the petition gained momentum, another blow landed. A reporter from the Park County Chronicle, intrigued by rumors swirling after the 911 incident and tipped off by disgruntled residents, published an investigative piece delving into the Golden Meadow HOA's finances under Eleanor's tenure. The article detailed questionable expenditures, exorbitant fees paid for minor landscaping infractions, pursued legally inflated contracts awarded for aesthetic upgrades that seemed primarily to benefit properties near Eleanor's own home, and a general lack of transparency in budgeting. The report painted a picture not just of rigid control, but potentially of self-serving financial mismanagement. Simultaneously, Ben Carter officially filed Jed Stone's lawsuit against the Golden Meadow HOA, and Eleanor Vance personally citing targeted harassment, violation of property rights, and emotional distress caused by the pattern of intimidation, culminating in the false emergency report. News of the lawsuit spread quickly, adding legal pressure to the mounting community backlash. The emergency HOA meeting, held a week later in the small community clubhouse, was packed beyond capacity. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder, an air of grim determination replacing the usual apathy. Eleanor Vance, flanked by a visibly strained Arthur Pendleton, attempted to control the proceedings opening with prepared remarks about fiscal responsibility and maintaining standards, but the residents weren't having it. One by one, homeowners stood up, voices trembling initially but growing stronger. They recounted stories of unreasonable fines, arbitrary enforcement, and Eleanor's dismissive attitude. They brought up the financial report, demanding explanations. They spoke of the fear and embarrassment caused by the massive police response to her false 911 call. Maria Flores calmly read aloud the number of signatures on the resignation petition. Eleanor tried to defend herself, deflecting blame, questioning the reporter's motives, even attempting to frame Jed Stone once more as the source of the community's problems. But her arguments fell flat against the tide of collective anger and evidence. Her voice grew shrill, her composure finally shattering completely, seeing the situation was unsalvageable. Arthur Pendleton abruptly stood up. I can no longer serve alongside Mrs. Vance under these circumstances," he stammered, looking pale but resolute. "Effective immediately, I resign my position as treasurer." Another board member quickly followed suit, cornered, humiliated, and abandoned by her remaining allies. Eleanor Vance stared out at the sea of hostile faces, then turned and stormed out of the clubhouse without another word. Her reign was over. In the following days, the newly forming interim HOA board acted swiftly to distance themselves from the debacle. Their first official act was instructing their attorney to settle Jed Stone's lawsuit. The terms were clear: a public acknowledgement of Stone's Throw Ranch's grandfathered rights, an exemption from the HOA's aesthetic regulations, payment of Jed's full legal fees, and a formalized permanent non-disturbance agreement, ensuring no future harassment. Jed accepted the settlement. Vindication wasn't about money. It was about the principle, about protecting his heritage. Meanwhile, word came that the Park County Sheriff's Office had forwarded the findings of their investigation into the false 911 call to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential charges against Eleanor. The debris, both literal and metaphorical, was finally being cleared. Autumn painted the Colorado plains in hues of gold and russet. A crisp coolness had settled into the air, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant wood smoke. Jed Stone stood on his porch, leaning against a familiar weathered post, surveying his land. The cattle grazed peacefully in the pasture. The old barn stood solid against the clear blue sky, and a sense of quiet equilibrium had returned to Stone's Throw Ranch. The siege was truly over. Months had passed since the tumultuous HOA meeting, and the swift settlement, life in Golden Meadow estates next door, had found a new, less abrasive rhythm. The interim HOA board, eventually formalized, focused more on genuine community events and essential maintenance than on policing paint colors or mailbox heights. There was a subtle shift Jed could feel, a tentative wave from a neighbor working in their yard, a less hurried pace on the walking paths bordering his property. It wasn't a complete merging of two different worlds, but the hard line drawn in the dust felt softer now, more permeable. Maria Flores still occasionally brought over baked goods, their conversations easy and friendly, News had filtered through town, confirmed by a casual remark at the feed store that Eleanor Vance had sold her house quickly and moved away, destination unknown. There was no fanfare, just a quiet departure, leaving behind the community she had tried so forcefully to mold in her image. Whether the district attorney had pursued charges remained unclear, but her chapter in Golden Meadow was definitively closed. Jed took a slow breath, the cool air filling his lungs. The ordeal felt like a distant storm. Now memorable but past, he'd been tested, pushed to defend not just his land, but the very principle of respectful coexistence. He'd stood firm, found unexpected allies, and weathered the worst of it. His heritage felt secure, his peace restored. The horizon looked clear again, holding the simple promise of seasons turning and life carrying on just as it always had on Stone's Throw Ranch. This story of Jed Stone's quiet battle against Eleanor Vance's overbearing HOA offers potent wisdom for our own lives. Like Jed, know your ground and stand firm on your principles and rights, especially when facing unreasonable pressure. Defend your heritage values or boundaries with calm resolve, not aggression. When conflict arises, particularly with bureaucracy or persistent opposition, meticulous preparation and documentation become invaluable tools. Jed's careful record-keeping ultimately fortified his position. Remember that consistent integrity builds trust and earns respect, often proving more powerful than loud demands or manipulation. Jed's actions spoke louder than Eleanor's rules. Furthermore, don't underestimate the power of community and unexpected alliances. Like Maria Flores and others who eventually supported Jed, shared struggles can reveal allies when you feel isolated. Stay open to connection. Finally, the narrative starkly illustrates how unchecked rigidity and the abuse of power often lead to self-destruction, as seen in Eleanor's downfall. True strength lies in fairness, adaptability, and respect for others, not just strict adherence to rules. Embrace these lessons, stand firm with integrity, prepare diligently, value community, and act justly. This builds resilience and helps you navigate life's challenges with grace and strength.